Imagine growing up your entire life being conditioned to believe that Robin Hood is, well, the ultimate romantic hero.
Right, it's the classic story. We're all taught it in grade school.
Exactly. You've got the plucky outlaw in Sherwood Forest who valiantly robs from the greedy, hoarding rich to give back to the struggling, deserving poor.
Yeah.
It totally frames our foundational understanding of fairness, equity, heroism. But then imagine having a highly successful, incredibly wealthy, and authoritative mentor sit you down, look you dead in the eye, and present a completely contradictory worldview. Imagine him telling you straight to your face, Robin Hood was not a hero. Robin Hood was a crook.
Oh man, that's just a massive paradigm shift.
Right.
It is entirely designed to completely shatter the conventional way we are taught to look at wealth and societal fairness right from childhood. I mean, when you take a revered cultural icon and reframe him as a thief, you are forcing a person to completely reevaluate their baseline assumptions about money.
And that deliberate, deeply uncomfortable paradigm shift is exactly where we are starting today. Welcome back to the deep dive. We are focusing squarely on Chapter 4, the history of taxes and the power of corporations.
A huge chapter.
It really is. We are venturing deep into Robert Kiyosaki's perspective in the book on how the wealthy truly operate behind the scenes, and more importantly, how the rules they play by are fundamentally different from the rules taught to everyone else.
So the mission for our analysis today is very specific. We're going to unpack the hidden history of taxation as laid out by Kiyosaki. We'll examine the intensely conflicting organizational mindsets of government bureaucracy versus true capitalism.
All right.
And finally, we will break down the mechanics of the ultimate legal shield utilized by the wealthy, the corporation.
Because listen, this isn't just a dry historical retrospective for you to passively consume on your commute. The argument presented is that this is a vital breakdown of the hidden rules of a financial game that you are already playing.
Whether you realize it or not.
Exactly. If you earn a paycheck, if you pay for groceries, rent an apartment, own a home, you are actively participating in this game. So let's begin by unpacking this initial assertion. The book posits that this Robin Hood fantasy, this whole pervasive societal ideal of taking from the rich to give to the poor, is actually the very mechanism that causes the most intense financial pain for the poor and the middle class today.
It sounds backwards at first.
It really does. Walk me through how Kiyosaki justifies that claim.
Well, Kiyosaki traces this financial pain directly back to a fundamental lack of historical understanding among the general public. To fully grasp how the middle class ended up carrying the heaviest tax burden in modern society, he insists we have to look at the actual origins of taxes.
Okay.
And the most jarring historical data point he presents is that originally, in both England and America, there were absolutely no permanent income taxes.
None at all, which is, that's a difficult concept to wrap your head around today.
Oh, completely.
Considering taxation is treated as this inevitable fact of life, right up there with death. But the book explains that back in the 18th and 19th centuries, taxes were merely temporary, voluntary chip-ins.
Yeah, they were ad hoc measures. They were treated as emergency fundraising campaigns rather than permanent structural fixtures.
Give us an example of that.
The book gives us very specific timelines to illustrate this. In Britain, these temporary taxes were levied primarily to fund the military efforts against Napoleon. That specifically ran from 1799 to 1816. Once the threat was neutralized, the tax was meant to dissolve.
Makes sense.
Right. And over in America, we see a remarkably similar temporary measure enacted to pay for the massive logistical costs of the Civil War, running from 1861 to 1865. The cultural understanding at the time was that the government only asked for your money when the very survival of the nation was at stake.
But obviously that cultural understanding shifted.
Radically.
The script eventually flipped from temporary emergency measures to permanent economic fixtures. According to the timeline in the book, permanent income taxes were officially adopted in 1874 in England, and then decades later, in 1913, in the United States with the adoption of the 16th Amendment.
Yep, the 16th Amendment.
But here is the piece of the puzzle that requires a deeper look. How did governments convince fiercely independent populations to accept a permanent tax on their labor? Especially in America. The nation was literally founded on a tax revolt. They threw tea into Boston Harbor over this exact issue.
It requires a profound psychological campaign.
Okay.
Kiyosaki argues that it took about 50 years in both countries to successfully sell the idea of a regular permanent income tax to the voting public. And the strategy they used to sell it was essentially weaponizing that Robin Hood fantasy we just discussed.
So they used the story against them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The masses, who made up the overwhelming majority of the voting bloc, were told that these new permanent taxes were created with one singular targeted purpose,
Right.
to punish the rich.
So it was pitched entirely as a penalty for the wealthy elite. The voting majority, so the working poor and the emerging middle class, they eagerly voted for the law because they believed they were sticking it to the upper class.
Right, they thought they were Robin Hood.
They believed they were using the power of the government to forcefully redistribute wealth downward. The constitutional amendment became politically viable purely on the explicit promise that it would only ever target the most affluent individuals in society.
That was the promise. But the historical reality, as framed in the book, is incredibly different. This is what Kiyosaki refers to as the ultimate bait and switch.
The bait and switch.
Once the government infrastructure tasted that massive influx of capital, its appetite for revenue expanded exponentially. The tax did not stay confined to the rich, because there simply weren't enough rich people to fund the growing ambitions of the state.
The net had to be cast wider.
Exactly. The tax eventually trickled down, continually expanding its reach into lower and lower income brackets until it heavily burdened the very people who originally voted for it, the middle and lower classes.
Oh.
The mechanism intended to punish the wealthy wound up becoming a massive, permanent financial anchor for the working public.
Now, just a quick pause here. Before we dive into the specific mechanics of how the wealthy evaded this anchor, it is crucial that we establish the framework of our discussion for you, the listener. We are impartially analyzing Robert Kiyosaki's historical viewpoints and his specific economic theories regarding taxation, wealth redistribution, and government operation as they are presented in the book.
Right, very important to state.
We are not taking a political stance on the morality of taxation, nor are we endorsing these views as infallible historical or economic fact. Our goal is to rigorously explore and decode the powerful, often controversial ideas contained in the book so you can understand the architecture of this specific financial philosophy.
That is a vital distinction to keep in mind. We are dissecting the architecture of a mindset. And part of understanding that mindset is looking at the real-world mathematical application. Kiyosaki asks his readers to reflect on their own current financial reality. If you look at your pay stub today, the historical shift is undeniable.
It's sobering when you look at the raw numbers. I mean, think about it. How much of your calendar year is spent just working to pay your tax obligations?
It's a lot.
The book highlights a staggering statistic. Average Americans work approximately 4 to 5 months out of the year, strictly to cover their taxes.
4 to 5 months.
That means from January all the way into May, every hour you work, every dollar of value you create is essentially going straight to the government to fund its operations. You aren't actually keeping the fruits of your own labor until late spring.
Which naturally leads to a deep philosophical division in how society views the system of taxation and government spending. To explore this division, the book introduces us to a brilliant contrast in organizational ideologies. Kiyosaki grounds his financial education in the immense friction of growing up between two very influential yet fundamentally opposed father figures.
The dichotomy of the two dads. This is the structural core of his entire philosophy. You have the educated dad, who is a high-ranking, highly credentialed government bureaucrat. And on the other side, you have the rich dad, who operated as a pure, unadulterated capitalist.
Let's analyze the educated dad first. How does Kiyosaki frame his worldview regarding money and government?
The educated dad is presented as a man who sincerely believed that government is a force for good and should actively intervene to help people. He idolized John F. Kennedy and was a passionate champion of the Peace Corps. In fact, he and his wife both work for the Peace Corps training volunteers.
So his moral compass was really aligned with public service.
Absolutely. Public service and the expansion of social safety nets. But it's his metric for professional success that Kiyosaki focuses on. For the educated dad, success in his career was entirely tied to the mechanics of government bureaucracy. The book explains that in his world, a manager's importance and effectiveness were measured by how many people he managed and how much money he spent.
Right.
A large government organization with a continually expanding budget is viewed internally as a respected, successful organization. Therefore, he was constantly striving to secure additional grants and justify budget increases.
Because it is the systemic reality of government funding.
Yeah.
Kiyosaki points out that the government ideal actively discourages having excess money at the end of a fiscal year.
Because if you don't spend it,
You lose it. If you are a government department head and you manage to operate efficiently enough to have surplus funds, you aren't rewarded for your frugality. Instead, you risk having your budget slashed in the next cycle because you've signaled that you don't actually need that much capital. This creates a relentless use it or lose it mentality, driving continuous mandatory spending.
Now let's contrast that entirely with the operational philosophy of the rich dad. His capitalist worldview was the exact inverse. Within his business empire, success was measured by how little money he could spend and how few people he needed to hire to achieve the same result.
Because in the private sector, excess money, which is profit, isn't a liability that threatens your future budget. It is the ultimate metric of operational efficiency. The fewer resources he consumed to generate revenue, the more profitable his enterprises became, and the more he was respected by his investors and peers.
And this wasn't just a polite difference of opinion. There was active hostility between these two viewpoints. The book recounts how the rich dad viewed government workers, noting that their objectives are entirely antithetical to those of business owners. The rich dad characterized government bureaucrats as a pack of lazy thieves who produced nothing and simply consumed capital.
Wow.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the educated dad viewed the wealthy capitalists as greedy, exploitative crooks who desperately needed to be taxed more heavily to fend societal needs.
You can just imagine the cognitive dissonance for a 10-year-old boy sitting in the middle of these two towering authority figures. Kiyosaki points out that both men actually had valid rational arguments based on the systems they operated within. But when you synthesize the history of taxes through the lens of these two opposing philosophies, a fascinating economic cycle emerges.
Let's break down that cycle.
Initially, that take from the rich tax policy made the voting public very happy. Why? Because that newly collected tax revenue immediately started flowing into the hands of government workers in the form of secure jobs, expansive benefits, and guaranteed pensions.
But it didn't just stay there.
No, paradoxically, it also flowed right back into the hands of the wealthy elite via highly lucrative government contracts to build infrastructure, supply the military, and provide institutional services.
So the government became a massive consumer of goods and services. But because of that bureaucratic objective we just analyzed, the inherent need to constantly spend all allocated funds to justify future budget growth, the fiscal management of that massive pool of tax money was structurally flawed from a capitalist perspective.
Precisely. As government spending continuously, irreversibly grew, the state's demand for capital skyrocketed. The original tax on the ultra-wealthy was no longer mathematically sufficient to feed the growing machine. And furthermore, the ultra-wealthy were actively finding ways to legally shield their capital.
So what happens?
Therefore, the tax the rich legislation had to be quietly amended and expanded to encompass lower and lower income brackets, eventually hitting the very middle class that championed the tax in the first place.
Which brings us to a pivotal realization in Kiyosaki's narrative. When the government came knocking with these new aggressive tax mandates, how did the truly wealthy respond? They did not simply sit there, roll over, and voluntarily hand over their fortunes.
Right.
They didn't accept the new paradigm as an inescapable reality of life.
No, they reacted strategically. They utilized their resources, their influence, and their financial literacy to legally alter their circumstances. They didn't mount a physical rebellion, they mounted
A legal one.
Exactly. They mounted a legal rebellion. They hired the smartest attorneys, the most brilliant accountants, and the most aggressive tax strategists. They scoured the thousands of pages of new tax code to find the legal loopholes. And most importantly, as Kiyosaki details, they retreated behind the ultimate legal escape hatch, the corporate entity.
I want to spend a significant amount of time unpacking this because the concept of the corporation is so frequently misunderstood. What is fascinating is the historical origin of the corporation itself. It wasn't originally conceived as a convoluted tax dodge. Kiyosaki traces the popular use of corporate structures all the way back to the era of global maritime trade and sailing ships.
Oh yeah, this history is fascinating. If you look at the 1600s and 1700s, rich investors and merchants wanted to finance massive, ambitious voyages to the New World or the East Indies to trade for spices and treasures. The potential profits were staggering, but the physical and financial risks were astronomical. Ships were routinely lost to typhoons, piracy, or disease.
And under the standard laws of commerce at the time, if you funded a venture and it failed, you were personally liable for all the debts. If the ship sank, the creditors could come after your personal estate, your manor, your horses, everything you owned, to settle the debts of the lost voyage.
Everything.
You could be financially ruined by a single rogue wave.
Exactly. So the wealthy investors demanded a legal mechanism to specifically limit their financial exposure. They conceptualized the corporation. They would pool their capital into this newly invented legal vehicle to finance one specific voyage. If that particular ship went down, the loss to the rich investor was strictly limited only to the specific amount of capital they had invested in that single corporate entity.
Brilliant.
The rest of their personal assets were entirely insulated from the creditors.
It was a revolutionary mechanism for asset protection. It allowed capitalism to scale by mitigating catastrophic personal risk. But as we move forward in history, as modern tax laws evolved and became increasingly aggressive, this vehicle of asset protection morphed into something even more powerful, an impenetrable tax shield.
Right.
But before we get into the complex mechanics of corporate taxation, we need to strip away the cultural mythology of what a corporation actually is.
There is a massive public misconception about this. When the average person hears the word corporation, their mind immediately conjures images of a sprawling, smoke-belching industrial complex or a towering, shining glass skyscraper in Manhattan filled with thousands of employees in cubicles. They view a corporation as a massive, tangible, physical behemoth.
But Kiyosaki strips all of that cinematic imagery away. The reality of a corporation is remarkably mundane, but infinitely more accessible and powerful. He explicitly states that a corporation is not really a physical thing at all. You can't touch it.
It is merely a file folder sitting in an attorney's office or a state registry. It is a collection of specific legal documents, properly formatted, signed, and registered with a government agency. It is an artificial construct recognized by the state. The book beautifully describes it as a legal body without a soul.
A legal body without a soul. That phrasing is so evocative because it highlights the mechanical, emotionless nature of the entity. And by funneling their wealth and their business operations into these soulless legal entities, the rich were once again able to protect their capital from the grasping hands of the tax authorities.
Yep.
Why? Because the rules of the economic game are fundamentally structurally different for a corporate entity than they are for a human being.
This brings us to what we can call the golden rule of corporate taxes, which Kiyosaki illustrates with a very simple yet profoundly impactful diagram in the book. To truly grasp why the rich get richer, we have to meticulously walk through the flow of money for an individual employee versus the flow of money for a corporation.
Let's do that. Let's map out the employee side first. This is the traditional path, the path of going to school, getting good grades, and securing a safe, secure W-2 job. The flow of money here is straightforward, predictable, and ultimately financially punishing. Step 1, you earn money. You trade your time and expertise for a predetermined salary.
Step 2, the government immediately intervenes. Before you ever see a single dollar of that paycheck, the state extracts its share through income taxes, payroll taxes, Social Security, and Medicare. The money is automatically withheld. You have absolutely no control over this extraction.
None. And then step 3, you receive the remainder, the net income. And you are forced to try to live on, budget for, and spend whatever is left over to cover your mortgage, your groceries, your transportation, and your family's needs. Earn, pay taxes, spend.
Now, Kiyosaki asks us to flip the script and look at the corporate side of the diagram. For a business owner operating their enterprise through a corporate structure, the temporal flow of money is entirely reorganized. Step 1, the corporation earns money by providing goods or services to the market.
And step 2 is where the magic happens.
Exactly. The corporation spends everything it legally and legitimately can on allowable business expenses. It pays for its operations, its expansion, its marketing, and its necessary equipment.
And then, only at step 3 does the government arrive. The corporation pays taxes only on the net profit that is left over after all of that spending has occurred. Earn, spend, pay taxes.
That subtle shift in the timeline. Spending before taxes versus spending after taxes. That is presented by Kiyosaki as one of the most profound wealth-building secrets in the modern world. It is the biggest legal tax loophole utilized by the wealthy.
To understand the mathematical advantage, let's hypothesize a scenario. Imagine an employee and a corporation both generate $100,000 in a year. The employee is immediately taxed, let's say at an effective rate of 30%. The government takes $30,000 off the top.
Gone.
The employee now has $70,000 left to pay for their car, their travel, their meals, and their equipment.
Conversely, the corporation generates that same $100,000. Before the government touches a dime, the corporation can legally deduct $50,000 in legitimate business expenses. Perhaps a vehicle used for the business, travel for client meetings, specialized equipment, and marketing meals. The corporation's taxable income is now reduced to just $40,000.
Right.
The government then taxes that remaining $40,000, often at a lower corporate tax rate.
So the employee is trying to build a life with tax dollars. The business owner is building an empire with pre-tax dollars. The mathematical advantage of compound growth in that scenario is staggering over a 10 or 20-year period.
Oh, without a doubt.
Let's ground this in some concrete illustrative examples directly from Robert Kiyosaki's analysis to really drive this home. How does this look in the day-to-day life of a wealthy individual? Well, if you own a corporation and manage your affairs correctly, your annual vacation can potentially become a legitimate tax-deductible board meeting in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Your car payments, your auto insurance, your vehicle repairs. If the vehicle is utilized for the business, they become pre-tax company expenses.
The book even mentions that certain health club memberships or healthcare costs, if structured properly within a corporate wellness plan, can be expensed. Even a significant portion of your restaurant meals, if you are genuinely discussing business and attempting to generate revenue, can be written off. It is entirely legal, heavily documented, and it is all done with dollars that the government has not yet taxed.
It fundamentally changes how you view a dollar. A dollar to an employee is really only worth 70 or 80 cents in purchasing power. A dollar to a corporation is worth a full dollar of purchasing power. But the tax advantages Kiyosaki outlines don't stop at daily operational expenses. He dives heavily into real estate and introduces a very specific, incredibly powerful piece of the U.S. tax code, Section 131.
The 1031 exchange is a perfect example of how the tax code actively rewards capitalist behavior. A 1031 exchange allows an investor to defer paying capital gains taxes on the profitable sale of a piece of real estate, provided they reinvest those profits into a new, more expensive, like-kind property within a very strict time frame.
Let's walk through how this works practically. Say you buy a small duplex for $100,000. Over 5 years, the market booms, and you sell it for $250,000. You have a $150,000 profit. Normally, if you just take that cash, the IRS is going to hit you with a massive capital gains tax bill, potentially wiping out $30,000 or more of your profit. You've lost a huge chunk of your capital.
But if you execute a 1031 exchange, you take that entire $250,000 and immediately use it as a down payment on a $1 million apartment complex. Because you kept the money moving, because you reinvested it into the economy rather than hoarding it, the government allows you to completely defer that tax bill.
It's amazing.
Your entire pool of capital goes to work for you in the new, larger asset.
And as Kiyosaki points out, you can do this indefinitely. You can keep trading up in value, from a duplex to an apartment building to a commercial strip mall, legally delaying the tax burden at every single step. You are keeping 100% of your equity rolling into bigger and better cash flowing assets. You are only finally taxed if you completely liquidate and cash out. Kiyosaki argues that if you are investing in real estate and you aren't utilizing these legal vehicles, you are missing out on massive compounding opportunities to build your asset column.
And it is vital to note that beyond just the profound tax advantages, there is the incredible benefit of lawsuit protection. Kiyosaki accurately observes that we live in a highly litigious society. People are constantly looking for opportunities to sue for damages.
But when a plaintiff's attorney tries to sue a truly wealthy individual, they rarely find a massive exposed pot of gold. Instead, they hit a brick wall of complex legal protection. Why? Because the wealthy operate under a fascinating, almost paradoxical philosophy: control everything but own nothing.
That is the ultimate defensive strategy. The rich systematically hide their wealth inside multiple layers of these soulless legal bodies. Various corporations, LLCs, and trusts. The corporation owns the real estate. Another corporation owns the equipment. A trust owns the intellectual property. So on paper, as an individual human being, the wealthy person might look completely broke. They personally own very little.
Contrast that with the financial behavior of the poor and the middle class. They strive to personally own everything. They want their name on the deed to their house, their name on the title to their car, their name on all their investments. They tie their ego to personal ownership.
Their mistake.
And therefore, they leave their entire net worth exposed to government taxation, to creditors, and to opportunistic lawsuits. If they get sued and lose, they lose everything.
Kiyosaki highlights a cruel historical irony here. The middle class essentially learned this vulnerability from the Robin Hood narrative itself. The idea that wealth should be forcefully taken from those who have it. But because the rich anticipated this and shielded themselves behind corporate entities, the intellectual class and the government bureaucracy ended up taking from the exposed, unshielded middle class instead.
So, synthesizing all of this historical and legal theory, what does this actually mean for you, the listener? How do you apply this? Kiyosaki's core argument is that if you want to stop being financially penalized by the system, if you want to play the game by the rules of the wealthy, you have to actively build what he calls your financial IQ. He states repeatedly that ignorance of the law is incredibly expensive. Knowledge in this arena is literal financial power.
And he doesn't just leave financial IQ as a vague buzzword. The book methodically breaks this concept down into 4 highly specific pillars of knowledge. This isn't just about learning how to balance a checkbook or clip coupons. It is about understanding the entire macroeconomic board game.
Let's dedicate some time to deeply unpacking each of these 4 pillars because they form the foundation of his entire wealth-building strategy. Pillar number 1, accounting. Kiyosaki refers to this as baseline financial literacy. It is the vital left brain skill of reading numbers, analyzing spreadsheets, and understanding financial statements.
It is the language of business. If you cannot read an income statement and a balance sheet, you cannot accurately identify the strengths and weaknesses of any business, including your own personal household finances. You won't be able to distinguish an asset, something that puts money into your pocket, from a liability, something that takes money out.
Right.
Without accounting skills, you are flying blind. As your wealth grows and your investments become more complex, you need absolute accuracy, or the entire house of cards comes tumbling down.
Then we move to pillar number 2, investing. If accounting is the left brain, analytical side, investing is the right brain, creative side. This is the science and the art of making your money make more money.
Investing involves formulating specific strategies, evaluating risk versus reward, and employing creative problem solving to turn a small initial amount of capital into a massive, self-sustaining, cash-flowing machine. It is about understanding asset classes, real estate, paper assets, businesses, commodities, and knowing how to deploy your capital into the right vehicle at the right time.
Which flows perfectly into pillar number 3, understanding markets. You can have great accounting skills and a solid investment strategy, but if you don't understand the market, you will fail. This is the science of supply and demand.
Kiyosaki stresses that you have to understand 2 distinct aspects of the market. First, the fundamental economic realities. Does this investment actually make sense based on current demographics, interest rates, and economic conditions? Does a piece of real estate make sense in a town where the major employer just went bankrupt?
Probably not.
No. And second, you have to understand the technical, emotion-driven aspects of the market. Markets are ultimately driven by human beings experiencing fear and greed. Is the current price of an asset driven by solid fundamentals, or are people just buying in a frenzy based on hype and FOMO? The fear of missing out. A high financial IQ requires the ability to step back, detach from the emotional panic or euphoria of the crowd, and analyze the raw data.
And finally, we arrive at pillar number 4, the law. This is the crucial overarching framework that holds the first 3 pillars together. Kiyosaki states that when you wrap a protective corporate structure around your technical skills of accounting, investing, and market analysis, it serves as an explosive multiplier for financial growth.
It's the difference between addition and multiplication. Utilizing tax advantages and corporate asset protection is the profound difference between walking barefoot to your destination and flying there in a private jet. It allows you to compound your wealth without the constant friction of aggressive taxation slowing you down.
To really hammer home how these 4 theoretical pillars work in reality and how they require a fundamental psychological shift, Robert Kiyosaki shares a fantastic, highly illustrative anecdote from his own life. The setting is 1974. He has recently finished his service in the Marine Corps, he's back in Hawaii, and he lands a very prestigious, high-paying corporate sales job at Xerox.
We need to set the scene of 1974. The economy is struggling with inflation, the stock market is volatile, and the conventional wisdom of the time is to find a massive, secure corporation and hold on for dear life. And by all conventional metrics of the 1970s middle class, Kiyosaki was succeeding wildly. He was considered a rising star. He was generating significant sales commissions.
But the book details his growing internal frustration. Every single time he received his substantial paycheck, he experienced severe disappointment. The tax deductions were absolutely massive. And the cruel mathematical irony of the employee tax quadrant was that the harder he worked, the more copiers he sold, and the more successful he became, the larger and more punitive those tax deductions grew. He was constantly hitting a financial ceiling imposed by the state. His bosses at Xerox were flattering him, dangling the promise of raises, bigger territories, and promotions. His educated dad was absolutely thrilled with his trajectory, encouraging him to keep his head down, work hard, and work his way up the corporate ladder.
But in his ear, functioning as a constant counter-narrative, he kept hearing the voice of his rich dad, asking a piercing, uncomfortable question. Who are you working for? Who are you ultimately making rich? The rich dad fundamentally rejected the premise of relying solely on a corporate paycheck for your livelihood.
He warned Kiyosaki that settling into the comfort of a high-paying salary would turn him into what he called a docile cow ready for milking. Milked by the corporation for his labor and milked by the government for his taxes. When Kiyosaki shared his educated dad's advice about diligently climbing the corporate ladder, the rich dad just chuckled, dismissed the premise entirely, and delivered what I think is one of the most powerful paradigm-shifting questions in the entire book. Why not own the ladder?
Why not own the ladder? That simple, incredibly ambitious question completely altered his trajectory. It forced him to shift his focus from being a highly paid cog in someone else's machine to becoming the architect of his own machine. So in 1974, while still working full-time as a W-2 employee at Xerox, he took action on Pillar 4. He formed his very first corporation.
Now, this is a crucial detail that often gets misinterpreted in the entrepreneurial space. He didn't dramatically quit his job, burn his bridges, and jump into the abyss. He used his job. He leveraged his high income. He started, as Kiyosaki phrases it, minding his own business on the side, focusing intensely on growing his personal asset column through his new corporate entity.
Many modern employers hold the assumption that if an employee is distracted by building their own side business, their primary work performance will inevitably suffer. But Kiyosaki explains that in his case, the exact opposite occurred. Forming that corporation and having a clear wealth-building goal gave him a profound, almost obsessive sense of purpose.
He wasn't just working to pay bills anymore. He was working to fund his escape. He came into the Xerox office early. He worked more diligently than anyone else. Why? Because he needed to amass as much seed capital as possible from his sales commissions to aggressively fuel the investments inside his new corporation.
He had identified a market opportunity using Pillar 3. He saw that real estate in Hawaii was just beginning to enter a massive boom cycle, and he desperately wanted to acquire assets before they became unaffordable. So he hustled. The more he realized the explosive potential of the real estate boom, the more Xerox machines he was motivated to sell. The more copiers he sold, the more commission he made.
Now, yes, as an employee, his paycheck deductions went up accordingly, which was financially painful to watch, but he used that pain as psychological fuel. He wanted out of the heavily taxed employee quadrant so badly that he essentially worked twice as hard at his day job just so he could inject more capital into his shielded corporate entity.
And his execution of this strategy was remarkably swift. By 1978, just 4 years later, he was consistently ranking as one of the top 5 salespeople at the entire Xerox Corporation. He was a master of his trade. But behind the scenes, away from the corporate spotlight, the real financial magic of the rich dad's philosophy was materializing.
He reached the tipping point. The book reveals that in less than 3 years of dedicated investing, he was actually generating more net income inside his small side hustle real estate holding corporation than he was making from his highly successful full-time job at Xerox.
He had achieved the crossover point, and the crucial distinction is the quality of that money. The money he was making inside his own corporation was passive income. It was money working for him. He wasn't out pounding the hot pavement in Honolulu selling copiers for that cash. His real estate assets, his tenants, were generating it automatically every month.
The cash flow from his properties became so robust that his company, his soulless, invisible legal entity, purchased him his very first Porsche.
And here is the profound kicker to the entire story. The moment that perfectly encapsulates the difference in financial paradigms. His fellow salespeople at Xerox, operating purely from an employee mindset, saw the Porsche and assumed he was financially irresponsible. They thought he was taking his hard-earned, heavily taxed commissions and blowing them on a depreciating liability, a fancy sports car to show off.
But he wasn't doing that at all. He was diligently taking his commissions and investing them into income-producing assets. It was the assets that generated the excess cash to buy the Porsche. And furthermore, because the Porsche was legally classified as a company car utilized by his corporation, it was purchased with pre-tax dollars. He was enjoying the luxury of a sports car while utilizing it as a legal tax deduction for his business.
As he articulates in the book, every single dollar he moved into his asset column was treated like a highly dedicated employee. Those dollar employees worked tirelessly around the clock, 247, with no sick days and no complaints, to generate even more employees and eventually to generate enough surplus cash to buy the boss a new Porsche. He successfully applied the contrarian lessons of the rich dad, built his foundational financial IQ across all four pillars, utilized the defensive power of the corporation, and effectively escaped the proverbial rat race at an incredibly early age.
It is a masterful, real-world application of the theory. It perfectly illustrates the ultimate lesson regarding leverage and control discussed throughout the chapter. If you work strictly for money as an employee, you voluntarily hand the vast majority of your power over to your employer and to the tax authorities. You are entirely at their mercy regarding how much you earn and how much you keep.
But if you can educate yourself and figure out how to make your money work for you, you retain the power. You control the flow of capital. And knowing the law, deeply understanding the corporate structure and how it interfaces with the tax code is what gives you a legitimate fighting chance against being financially eroded by a system designed to extract wealth from the uninformed.
That is incredibly heavy but incredibly necessary information to digest. Let's take a collective breath and summarize the massive scope of what we've unpacked today. By looking past the romantic mythology and understanding the true documented history of taxes, it reveals exactly why the wealthy continually refuse to play by the same set of economic rules as the middle class. The take from the rich Robin Hood narrative is essentially a political trap that inadvertently ensnares the working public. The wealthy utilize the invisible legal magic of corporations, those simple file folders sitting in state agencies, to completely restructure how their income is categorized and taxed. They protect their assets from litigation and aggressively grow their wealth, using the power of pre-tax dollars and deferred gains. Continuing to operate in ignorance of this legal structure is an incredibly expensive choice. As Kiyosaki repeats over and over, knowledge isn't just power, it is the ultimate asset.
Which leaves us with a rather profound and perhaps slightly uncomfortable provocative thought for you to mull over as we conclude. We've firmly established that a corporation is, legally speaking, a body without a soul. It is an emotionless vehicle for capital. But if you were to dedicate yourself to building one, to shifting the center of gravity of your entire financial life inside of one of these entities, how might that process fundamentally change your own psychological identity?
That is a fascinating question. Does stepping out of the vulnerable, highly taxed, dependent employee mindset and consciously stepping into the shielded, strategic, entity owner mindset fundamentally alter how you view risk, reward, and your own personal agency in society? Does it change how you view your relationship with the government, with your peers, and with your own labor?
It absolutely must. When you stop seeing yourself as a cog in the machine and start viewing yourself as the architect of the machine, your entire relationship with the world changes.
That is a deep structural question, and exactly the kind of perspective-shattering shift we aim to facilitate here on the Deep Dive. If exploring the history of taxes and the hidden power of corporations in Chapter 4 challenged your preconceptions today, do not let the intellectual momentum stop here. Subscribe and connect with us for our next educational podcast, where we will crack open the next chapter and continue rigorously decoding the financial strategies of the wealthy. You won't want to miss the next layer of this framework. Keep learning, keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time.